Good morning and welcome. Today we'll be talking about World War II from AMSCO Chapter 19, the second half of Chapter 19 for AP European History. We've got our note takers set up over here so you can kind of see where we're headed. Looking at the context of the war, the causes of the war, including this key term of appeasement, and then see some key events from World War II. So starting always with some context of what's going on at this time during the interwar years. So remember, we had World War I from 1914 to 1918, and World War I was the first modern war, the first war with industrialized weapons. And hopefully you remember at the conclusion of World War I in 1919, the Paris Peace Conference created the Treaty of Versailles. And one of the biggest things that the Treaty of Versailles did is it punished the heck out of Germany. It required Germany to take full responsibility for the war. It required them to disarm, maximum of 100,000 soldiers. They had to give up all of their overseas colonies and quite a bit of their land as well. So within this initial context of the Treaty of Versailles, during the interwar years, dictators begin to rise to power in Germany, wanting to avenge the Treaty of Versailles. In Italy, who felt like they kind of got a little screwed over by the Treaty of Versailles, I guess. So there's that anger against the Treaty of Versailles, and then there's the Great Depression, this massive worldwide economic crisis that starts in the US in 1929, moves to the rest of Europe and the rest of the world in the early 1930s. Germany was especially destroyed by the Great Depression because they had billions of dollars of debt from the Treaty of Versailles, and then the Great Depression makes things even worse. Now, most countries tried to have a democracy during the interwar years. Italy tried to have a democracy, and it lasted just a few years before Benito Mussolini took power in the in the mid 1920s. Germany had a democracy called the Weimar Republic that lasted for about 15 years until probably 1934. That's when you'd probably measure it. These democracies failed to solve the crisis. They failed to solve the economic depression, the anxiety that people felt, the frustration that people felt. So people began to call for stronger leaders. That helps to explain why Mussolini in Italy, Hitler in Germany are able to rise to power. So when we're talking about the context here, I'm going to basically just say that dictators rise to power in Italy and Germany. Italy and Germany have slight differences, but it's the same basic reasons why dictators rise to power. There's frustration at the Treaty of Versailles, kind of seen as unfair. There is the Great Depression, which leads to massive debt, massive inflation, and especially unemployment. And then the democracy fails to solve the problem. Dictators rise to power. They're looking to restore honor and glory to their country. You might remember the term fascism. A fascist is a dictator that relies on militarism, nationalism, and public support in order to gain power, which explains Benito Mussolini and Adolf Hitler well. And so much of World War II is all about Germany trying to retake their land that they lost after World War II. So you can see a map of Germany here before the war and then after the war. They lost this piece up here, Poland. They lost this piece over here to France. They lost some pieces down here, I believe. They lost this piece right here to Czechoslovakia. And so Hitler is eager to reclaim some of that land that he thought was stolen from him from the Treaty of Versailles. And so the start of World War II, the causes of World War II, in a way, it's a lot simpler than the causes of World War I. You might remember that the causes of World War I had the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand and this whole chess game amongst countries. And then there was militarism, alliances, imperialism, nationalism. The cause of World War II is, in a way, simpler. Hitler, in Nazi Germany, attempts to restore the German Empire and reclaim all of the land taken from him by the Treaty of Versailles and rebuild the military as well. So in 1935, he increases the army size to 500,000 and strengthens the navy. You might remember the Treaty of Versailles said there was a max of 100,000 soldiers. He makes it 500,000. In 1936, he rearms the Rhineland. The Rhineland was supposed to be a demilitarized border between Germany and France. He sends his troops there. In 1938, he annexes Austria. He says that there's German-speaking peoples there. That's part of the German culture. It deserves to be here. And then in 1938, he demands control of the Sudetenland, which was a region of 3 million Czechoslovakians, mostly German speakers, that he thought was part of the German culture. So Germany begins to violate the treaty and restore the German Empire. So they rebuild the army beyond the 100,000, and they annex Austria and the Sudetenland, part of Czechoslovakia. Now, it's that annexation of the Sudetenland that leads to a scenario called the Munich Conference. Now, take a minute and imagine for yourself that you are at a candy store. Imagine that a mom takes her 5-year-old son to the candy store. So it's a crowded day. Let's say they're going to the candy store because it's dad's birthday. They got to buy dad candy. The boy asks his mom if he can have some candy, and the mom says no. So what's the kid do? The kid cries and cries and throws a tantrum right in the middle of that candy store and demands that he won't stop crying until he gets his lollipop or whatever. The mom gives in, gives the kid some candy. 10 minutes later, the kid has finished the lollipop. He asks for some more candy. The mom says no, and the kid cries and cries and cries, throws another tantrum. This scenario is called the kid in the candy store. Okay, what's going to happen next? You're probably going to say that the mom's going to give the kid candy again because it worked to shut the kid up the first time. Now, who's to blame for the child's behavior? Again, giving you a second to think. Most of you, I'm guessing, are probably going to blame the mom. She's enabling her son's behavior. This scenario described in The Kid in the Candy Store is called appeasement. When you appease someone, you give in. You give them what they want to avoid a scene, to shut them up, to prevent a conflict, something like that. And so the mother appeases her 5-year-old son, gives him a lollipop just so he'll stop making a scene in the store. And England and France appease Hitler. They let him take that land in exchange for promises of peace. So 1938, Hitler formally annexes Austria, and in September, he tries to take the Sudetenland. At the Munich Conference, England, France, and Germany all meet to discuss German aggression and to discuss whether Hitler deserves these lands. And long story short, England and France, mostly England gives in. England appeases Hitler. England lets Germany take this land in exchange for a pinky swear promise from Hitler that he'll not attack anymore, that this will be the last piece of aggression that he'll do. Neville Chamberlain, the Prime Minister of England, comes home after the Munich Conference and he declares that we have created peace in our time. It's the photograph of that famous press conference where he declares we have created peace in our time. Well, this was September of 1938. In a year, World War II will begin because Hitler's going to go against his word and take even more land. And so why did they do that? Why did England and France appease Hitler? France wanted to go to war. France hates Germany. They thought Germany was weak and they could crush them. But England decided no. England decided no, we don't want to go to war. And it's possible that Neville Chamberlain trusted Hitler, although from what I've read, I don't think that's totally true. The main reason, I think, why England decided to appease Germany, why England decided to give in and let Germany take this land, is because in 1938, England was not ready for a war. It had been 20 years since World War I. The British people didn't want to go to war. The military wasn't very strong, and England was still in the middle of the Great Depression for them as well. And so if England had gone to war in 1938, the people would not have supported it, there wouldn't have been any morale, and the military wouldn't have been strong enough. 1 year later, when war finally does begin in September of 1939, England's had enough time to build up their army, and they're a little bit more ready for war. So at the Munich Conference of 1938, England appeases, let's say England lets Germany take the Sudetenland in exchange for a promise of peace. No more future attacks. This again is called appeasement. It's when you give in to someone's demands to avoid a conflict. Now, regardless of whether or not this was the right decision, and you can make an argument that no, this was not the right decision because Hitler's going to go to war anyways, or yes, it was the right decision because it gave England time to prepare for war. Regardless of what side you're on, 1 year later, World War II has begun. Hitler ignores his promises. First, in March of 1939, he invades all of Czechoslovakia, not just the Sudetenland, which is this kind of maroonish, purplish border, but he takes over all of Czechoslovakia. In August of 1939, he signs the Nazi-Soviet Pact, Nazi Germany, Soviet Russia. He allies with Stalin. Now, hopefully you think that's weird because not only are they two, egomaniacal dictators, but Stalin's a communist and Hitler hates communists. Remember the fire at the Reichstag when Hitler blamed the communists for the fire. Hitler hates communists. But what's in the middle of Germany and the Soviet Union? It's Poland. And so the Nazi-Soviet Pact allows Hitler to invade Poland without Soviet interference. Hitler finally does that on September 1st, 1939. That's the last straw for England and France. 2 days later, September 3rd, 1939, England and France declare war on Germany. So we'll say here, 1939, Hitler breaks his promise. He invades all of Czechoslovakia. He creates the Nazi-Soviet Pact in order to invade Poland. And then September 1st, 1939, Germany invades Poland, which 2 days later leads to World War II. Lots of questions about whether this could have been avoided, as to whether World War II could have been avoided if England and France had stood firm. Maybe. But it did seem clear that Hitler and Germany wanted to go to war. They were eager to go to war to take back their land. And so if England and France had stood firm, it probably would have led to war a year earlier, at a point when England was not nearly as prepared. Regardless of the what-ifs of history, World War II begins in September of 1939. And within the first 9 months, Germany is able to acquire a huge number of victories. First, when Germany declares war, they had already created the Axis powers with Germany, Italy, and Japan. And so you can see the Axis powers there in blue. Japan, with Japan's colonies in Manchuria, China, Korea, that looks like Cambodia, I think. Italy, with their colonies in Africa, including the colony of Ethiopia, and then Germany, who's got their kind of European empire. Now the Allied powers, they're in green, and so you can see the Allied powers have quite a bit more land. Anyways, Germany, Italy, Japan, they allied together to create the Axis powers. They're all, well, Germany and Italy are similar. They're both fascist. Japan's quite different. They had a military dictatorship, essentially. Despite these differences, they all had a similar cause. They all wanted to create an empire. Japan wanted to create an empire in the Pacific. Italy wanted to create a Mediterranean empire in North Africa and the Mediterranean. And Germany wants to create that European empire. So let's put in here the Axis powers, which is Germany, Italy, Japan, and each of them has their own goal to create a worldwide empire, or at least in their region. At the start of the war, Germany had quite a few very early victories. So Germany had many early victories using the blitzkrieg strategy. If you watch football, that word blitz might be familiar. What's it mean to blitz in football? Well, that's when you have all of a sudden like a sudden surprise rush from the defense against the quarterback. And so the blitzkrieg is like a lightning attack. It's a sudden surprise attack all at once, super, super fast to overwhelm the defenses or to overwhelm the quarterback in football. And the blitzkrieg had two stages. First, it had an Air Force attack, wipe out the defenses. That was by the Luftwaffe, which was the Nazi Air Force, best Air Force in the world. And then it was a ground invasion. Thousands, if not tens of thousands of troops in tanks and in incredibly fast troop transports to pour across. This 1-2 punch, this kind of back-to-back attack would wipe out the defenses and allow Germany to, within just days, invade Poland and conquer Poland, I'm sorry. Within months, conquer nearly all of Western Europe. Within weeks, conquer France. So this 1-2 punch allows them to wipe out defenses. And then Germany had the best military technology in the world. Again, part of the frustration against the Treaty of Versailles was that they had to disarm. And so Hitler's been rebuilding the army, rebuilding the technology. So that by 1940, Hitler has conquered all of those pink and light pink colors. He's got his initial empire of Czechoslovakia, Austria. He's got parts of Poland as well. But he also goes up to Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, and France. All of that in 9 months. The first 9 months of the war, called from September 1939 to June of 1940, is sometimes called the Phony War, because England hadn't actually sent troops and like fully committed to the war yet. But in those first 9 months, Hitler is able to conquer nearly all of Europe. The only people that's left, Spain, who was neutral, but had Hitler support, Great Britain, and then the Soviet Union, which we'll see in a minute. By June of 1940, Hitler has conquered nearly the entire continent, and he now turns his attention to England. Now, England's an island nation. Hitler can't simply send his troops across the English Channel, and so the blitzkrieg strategy won't work. He can do the Air Force attack, but he can't do the ground invasion. And so what Hitler decides to do is he decides to send nightly air raids, nightly air bombings of London and other civilian targets. The idea of Hitler was to crush the morale of the British people, to force them to surrender. Every single night from June of 1940 until June of 1941, every single night Hitler would send planes across the English Channel from France to Great Britain and London. Every single night, the British citizens would hear the air raid sirens and they'd rush to their shelters. And every single night, they would eventually emerge to assess the damage. Oftentimes, they would hide in subway stations. And after a year of constant air raids and constant bombings, England does not give up. They do not surrender. Inspired by their new Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, who kind of rallied the people to work together and to stand together, England refuses to surrender, and Hitler gives up. He decides to stop trying to conquer England. And this is one of the key turning points, or one of the early turning points of World War II. In 1941, Germany will not conquer England. England will remain a strong allied country, which will become important as the war continues. So we'll say Germany fails to conquer England after the failed Battle of Britain. Battle of Britain was nightly air attacks on London and civilian populations. The goal here again was to crush morale, but eventually Hitler gives up and he moves on. Some photographs here. This shows the nightly devastation, fires of the bombings, but yet life would continue. This famous photograph of a milkman still going through his daily runs to deliver milk. And then a famous photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral, still standing. It was never destroyed, despite the destruction around it. And that was me trying to take the same photograph from apparently the same spot, although it looks like I might be a few feet off. And then this was the war rooms. The British government, they're normally housed in Parliament along the River Thames. Parliament, the British government, they moved their entire government underground. It's called the Churchill War Rooms. Today it's a museum. Here's the line to get into it. It's like, I don't know, quarter mile from Buckingham Palace, where the King and Queen live. So you go downstairs from here, and then everything's underground, reinforced by like 10 feet of concrete. This was Winston Churchill's bed and his private office. And then there would be all sorts of bells and alarms if there were a fire, a gas attack, an air attack, etc. And then this is where the British military would have their strategy meetings. The maps are the actual maps that were left over when the war ended in 1945. They might be recreations, but they are recreated to show the status of the war when the war finally ended. And so England lived underground. Well, the government at least operated underground for about 4.5 years. No, 5 years. June of 1940 until summer of 1945. Now, after Hitler fails to conquer England, he still wants to have that European empire. He figures like, all right, crap, I'm not going to be able to invade England, but I can still invade Russia. Now, that might be kind of weird because you might remember the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939 was a non-aggression treaty between Germany and the Soviet Union. That allowed both countries to invade the Soviet Union without war. Oh, sorry, my bad. It allowed both nations to invade Poland without conflict. But Hitler always hated Stalin. He never trusted Stalin. And so once things begin to turn against Hitler in Western Europe, Hitler says, you know what? Screw that Nazi-Soviet pact. I'm going to invade Russia. June of 1941, Operation Barbarossa. Germany invades the Soviet Union, breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact. And for the next 2 years, again, Germany fails to conquer their target. They failed to take Leningrad and Stalingrad, these two major industrial cities in Russia, despite the fact that over 1 million Soviets were killed. Many of them were civilians. The citizens of Leningrad and Stalingrad, they just bunkered down. They would eat rats, or they would melt snow water to drink. They would peel the wallpaper off the wall. They would boil it because the glue would have just a little bit of nutrients in it. And so Germany will not conquer England. And then a couple of years later, they fail to conquer the Soviet Union as well. This super famous photograph of a Soviet soldier waving the Soviet flag as the German troops kind of finally pull out of the Soviet Union. So we'll say, sorry, for back from the Battle of Britain, this is the first turning point. Germany will not conquer England. And then you've got Operation Barbarossa. I gotta make sure I spell it right. June of 1941. Germany invades the Soviet Union, again breaking the Nazi-Soviet pact. And despite huge Soviet losses, especially civilians, the USSR stands firm. Germany fails. So here's that other turning point. Germany will not conquer the USSR. And so this is always so fascinating because remember, I'm going to go back to the map a little bit earlier here. Remember, in just 9 months, from September 1939 to June of 1940, Hitler had conquered this whole swath of Europe. He's basically conquered all of continental Europe. Switzerland was neutral, but actually supported Hitler. Spain was neutral, but had Hitler's support. So 9 months, Hitler conquers all of this. They fail to conquer England for a year. They failed to conquer the Soviet Union for 2 years. The failure to conquer Great Britain, that's because Germany cannot send their ground invasion troops, and so the second stage of the blitzkrieg doesn't work. And then the Soviet Union just has such a huge population, and the people rally together and fight back against the Germans. And the cold winter, I suppose, too. The war kind of just gets sucked into like a quagmire where nothing changes for 3 years or so. The Allies, US, England, Soviet Union, France as well, the Allies finally win the war in 1945 after the US joins. The US joins in December 1941 after Pearl Harbor. A naval base in Hawaii is bombed by Japan. But even though the US officially declares war on Germany in December 1941, and they fight some wars in North Africa and Italy, the US does not actually send troops to Western Europe until June of 1948 for something called D-Day. On D-Day, the US, Canada, and England, in a joint force among the three countries, the US, Canada, and England send their troops across the English Channel to Normandy. They invade the beaches of Normandy, and despite the fact that the Germans had all sorts of defenses along the beach, machine gun nests and things like that, the Allied forces, US, England, Canada, are able to conquer the beachhead. Once they conquer the beachhead, they're able to send their ships and their tanks and their vehicles and weapons across, and then they slowly push to Germany. Just to show this map a little bit, where I'm talking about, Normandy's right here, and so England sends their troops across the English Channel right here. Now Hitler knew that eventually the Allies were gonna have a aquatic invasion, a land-based invasion from England to Europe, to continental Europe. But Germany thought it was going to be at Dover, which is the shortest point between England and Belgium. And England knew that that's what Germany expected, and so they actually created decoy tanks and decoy planes. When Germany flew surveillance planes over England along the coast, they saw what they thought were thousands of tanks and thousands of planes and thousands of ships. So Germany was convinced that England was going to invade at Dover, right there. So that's where Germany put all the defenses. All of those tanks and planes and ships were actually inflatables. They were balloons made to look from the sky like tanks, when really the real forces were farther here in the south. They would be hidden in bunkers and in hangars and things like that, so they couldn't be seen. Once they take Normandy, they slowly push. They free France. They free France from the Nazis, so now the French join the forces. They move up to Belgium at a famous battle called the Battle of the Bulge. My wife's grandfather actually fought at the Battle of the Bulge. He was captured by the Germans and lived in a German prisoner of war camp for several months until the war ended. And then finally, the Allied forces push into Germany. They go to Berlin. The Soviets do the same thing on the other side. They surround Hitler and they force him to surrender. Before Hitler surrenders, he commits suicide. He makes his mistress, Eva Braun, take a cyanide pill. He shoots himself in the head. And just a week later, that was on August 30th, 1945, in the first week of May, I want to say May 6th, but I might have the date wrong, Germany surrenders and the war in Europe is over. And so this last turning point is D-Day. Sorry, I was just telling a story for a while. June 6, 1944, the Allies invade Nazi-occupied France. And this is kind of the last turning point. And it eventually leads to a German retreat and eventually a surrender. And so the last question to ask kind of is like, why did the Allies win World War II? It seemed like Hitler had the advantage for so long, and yet it just kind of stalled. Part of it is the US entry into World War II. sending fresh supplies, fresh troops, especially on D-Day, June 6th. D-Day stood for Day of Days. Also, the US invested in military technology. So the Allies did all sorts of bombing raids, especially at Dresden, which was a industrial town in Germany. The US dropped so many bombs in Dresden that it literally created a firestorm. It created its own climate within the city of Dresden because so many bombs were falling. And so the citizens of Dresden would go outside, they would go into a wide open street, and they would see a wave of fire clouds coming their way that would engulf them and kill them. So they did bombing raids, and then eventually they create the nuclear bomb that was used against Japan. Hiroshima and Nagasaki, August 4th and August 9th, 1945. The only two times nuclear weapons have ever been used. So part of it was because, part of the reason why the Allies won is because of that investment in technology. Part of it is because the Soviet Union completely committed to the war effort, army and civilians. Now, the Soviet Union is going to be pissed. Stalin's going to be pissed because they fought Germany by themselves basically for 2 years, 1940, 41, 42, 43. Civilians took up arms, civilians defended their town. And while the Soviet army was the biggest in the world, they also suffered the most deaths. And so these last two graphs are going to show us, first, perhaps why the Allies won. They had the advantage in technology. Tanks, the Allies have 3.5 million more tanks than the Axis powers. Artillery and heavy weaponry, heavy guns, they've got 5 million more. Aircraft, the Allies have 300,000 more. Not sure what's up with the missiles. And then ships, they've got 50,000 more. So a huge technological advantage for the Allies, US, England, France, Russia. And then this shows us the losses. Germany lost the war. You can see they've got about 6 million deaths, about 3.5 million military, 2.5 million civilian. Many of those civilian deaths were towards the end of the war when the Soviet forces pushed into Germany and were quite ruthless with their treatment of civilians. But the Soviet Union suffered the most, 11 million military deaths, nearly 7 million civilian deaths. All told, that adds up to about 20 million. I know the numbers don't totally add up there. And so when we push to the next big global crisis in our class called the Cold War, much of the Cold War is about the Soviet Union feeling betrayed, feeling forgotten by the US and England. They suffered so much, and yet the US and England only suffered less than 1 million combined. So keep that idea in the back of your mind about the betrayal that the Soviets felt. But for now, it's a time of victory, victory in Europe in May of 1945, victory in Japan in August of 1945. And the Germans finally have been defeated. Feel free to pause here. Again, looking at the causes of World War II, mainly German aggression. And that question of appeasement, whether that was the right play for England. And then some of the key turning points in the war. Germany's failure to conquer England, their failure to conquer the Soviet Union, the entry of the US, and then that massive US investment that massive Allied investment in military technology, eventually leading to an Allied victory.